Hey, Michael with XForcePC. I want to talk about our RTX Pro system. And the reason we have the word Pro thrown in there, well, you're going to find out in a few minutes, but mainly it's because it has the i9-9900K in it. And so you can use that for gaming, but then also it's really good for things like video editing, 3D rendering, professional type applications, desktop publishing, AutoCAD, all those types of things that use many, many cores and threads. So the 9900K is an 8-core, 16-thread processor, and it's pretty power hungry. And one of the important things about keeping this processor stable is the power delivery, which we're going to talk about more in a minute. Now, this processor has a base frequency of 3.6 gigahertz and a single core turbo frequency of 5 gigahertz, meaning that if you just slap this into a motherboard, it will run 5 gigahertz if you load up one core 100%. So you do something that's single threaded, meaning it loads one core 100%, then the processor will turbo up to as high as 5 gigahertz. Now, the way we have this system set up is it will run at 5 gigahertz on one core being loaded up, or all 8 cores and 16 threads being loaded up at 5 gigahertz. Now, on a typical system, if you don't do any sort of magic to make it stay at 5 gigahertz, it'll drop down close to, if not at, the base frequency, which is 3.6 gigahertz. So you go to render something, or you're playing a game that uses 4 or 6 cores, you're not going to be getting that 5 gigahertz. It's going to drop down in the low 4s, and then if you load up all the cores, it's probably going to drop all the way down to 3.6 gigahertz. Now, the key to being able to maintain 5 gigahertz across all 8 cores and 16 threads has to do with power delivery. And so we're going to talk about power delivery next. So when it comes to power delivery, there's to the processor, there's really 3 components. There's the motherboard's power connectors, there's the motherboard's voltage regulator modules, or VRMs, and then there is the power supply itself. So first, let's talk about the motherboard. Here on the motherboard, this is where the processor gets its dedicated power, or these connectors here. And motherboards can come with a single 4-pin, a single 8-pin, or they can come like this one with an 8-pin and a 4-pin. Now, you heard me reference in some earlier videos the Walmart PC. Walmart had a failed experiment where they built their own PCs, and the really cheap motherboard that they were using had a single 4-pin connector, just like this one here, which is very marginal, especially considering they're using an i7-8700 processor. But on this board, you see we have again, a 4-pin and an 8-pin, and this also requires sort of a special power supply. Most power supplies have an 8-pin power connector on them, and to be able to deliver an 8 and a 4-pin power connection, you have to have 2 wires running from the power supply, meaning two places to plug in for power for the processor. So you can't just use any old power supply. You have to use one that's a little higher end that has these 2 power connections. And so we'll talk about the power supply in just a second. The other thing is the VRM. On here, it's not a crazy high-end VRM, but it does have a 10+2 phase VRM. So there's 10 phases dedicated to the CPU, and then 2 phases dedicated to kind of all the I/O that doesn't really draw a whole lot of power. So that kind of talks about the motherboard and the motherboard connections. Next, we'll have a look at the power supply. Okay, so the power supply we have here is an 850 watt, and it has a nice big fan which moves a lot of air and will also be quiet. Now, it's a fully modular power supply, meaning there are no power connections on here at all. Everything comes unplugged. So what that allows us to do is only plug in the things that we need. Most power supplies have all the wires coming out, and you just use a fraction of those wires, and then you have to sort of bundle up the wires in a ball and stick them down, kind of cable tie them down in the bottom of the case. But on this, we plug in only the power connection or the power cables that we need. And then we have this huge, I can barely grab it with one hand, but these are all the various power cables we could plug in. Now on this system, we actually just plug in a fraction. We have I gotta get my glasses updated. We have the motherboard, the two motherboard power connectors. We need one of the PCI Express connectors. We need one SATA connector to power the lighting in the system. And then we have two dedicated CPU connections right here. I mentioned that earlier in the video, but we have two connectors for CPU power. And again, you're not going to find that on just a common power supply these days. It will start to become more common, over time but again, even on the low end, it's not going to become common anytime soon. So having the two dedicated power connections for the CPU allows us to deliver very stable power to the system. And this system on the 12-volt rail can deliver 70.8 amps, which is an insane amount of power to deliver. So single 12-volt rail, which is typically what you want, because you start splitting the 12-volt rail into multiple rails, then you're limited to the amount of power you can send to any one place. So tons and tons of power, 850 watts, big fan, two CPU power connections, and plenty of expandability. And so what you'll get from us is we'll just plug in only the cables that we need to plug in, which will be about 1/3 to 1/4 of these plugs here. And then all the other wires we'll provide to you in case for some reason down the road you need to add, something to the system. You'll have those power connectors available to you. Okay, so let's talk about the star of the show, which is the RTX system here. I know I'm not really in the shot all that well, but I wanted to show you mostly the system. So let's start here in the front. In the front, you see we have a little bit of subtle lighting here, and we also have a little stripe down the side here which lights up. You can change the color of the light as well as the mode of the light, so it can fade out and fade back in. It can kind of do a rainbow color, and then you can just do a solid color, which probably most of you are going to want. And then when you change it to that solid color, then you can go in here and make it whatever you want. There's green. I don't know how well this picks up on the camera. There's a sort of an aqua, and a blue, and a different blue, and a different blue, and a pink, and so forth. So I don't know, there's about 15 different colors, maybe more. I usually go for red or blue. Anyway, I know most of you aren't going to care that much about the lighting, but anyway, it's just a little button. Right there are two buttons on the top. One will change the mode of the lighting, like whether or not it fades in and out, and the other will change the actual color of the lights. Then here in the front we have some filtration down this side and this side, and I have the lights off right now so you could see the lighting on the case. I'm going to go ahead and shed a little light on this so maybe we can see the details a little bit more. But this is where the filtration is, and this cover comes off pretty easily, and it's completely free. There are no wires connecting it. You notice I can just hold it in my hand, and there's some little copper connectors here which touch some copper connectors down here for your lighting. And so you don't have a wire sort of coming off of this that you've got to deal with when you take this cover off, because you're going to want to clean this filter out periodically. Now you can remove this filter. The little filter, I know you can't see what I'm doing here, but the little filter that goes down the side does come off, and the filter mesh is plastic, so you could take and go rinse it off in the sink if you wanted to, or if you wanted to take, sorry if I'm making noise with this thing, snapping the filter back in. If you wanted to take the low-tech approach, you could simply just, sort of brush this off periodically with some sort of like brush. Probably have the computer off when you do that, so you don't suck the dust into the computer, but just sort of brush it off if you don't want to take the cover off. Obviously here you can see two fans. Just on the other side of this is the water cooler. So these are the two fans that have to do with the radiator and the water cooler is what you're seeing here. And then when you go to snap this back on, you just push it, goes right back on, and you see our lights come back on again. And the connectors that hold this front on are really high quality. They're not the type that are just plastic that kind of splay out. These actually have some really good retention mechanisms so that if you're pulling this off several times a year to clean it, they're not going to wear out. Now around the side, you know, we have this little strip of light here, which you may or may not care a rip about. We have a tempered glass side panel, which is a really elegant design. Looks really nice. It's tinted, so you'll pick up a little bit of what's inside the computer. Like right now, you can probably sort of see what's in there, but not, you know, you're not seeing every little detail. So that's kind of a cool look. We have a shroud down here which covers up the power supply. It also isolates the power supply in its own sort of air chamber. Power supply air comes in through the bottom and goes out through the back. And because that's the way the power works, we have, if I can get my hands under here, let me tilt this up a little bit. We have a filter under here that's fairly easily removed, although I struggled a little bit. Just slides right back in, there we go. And so every 6 months or so, you want to pull that out and clean the filter off. You might be able to see the hoses here for the water cooling. We'll also look at the top here briefly. If I can turn this. You know, we've got power, and we've got the two buttons I mentioned for the lighting. We've got two USB 3.0s. We've got a microphone and a headphone jack. And we've got a couple of fans in the top blowing straight out the top for cooling. And, you know, around back, it's sort of standard stuff. We have the power supply. We give you at least a couple of USB 2.0s, which we have to add because boards nowadays really aren't coming with USB 2.0. We have our Wi-Fi antennas as well. We have 8-channel audio, gigabit Ethernet. We have some USB 3.1 and 3.0 ports as well. And of course, a fan blowing straight out of the back. So, it's a pretty nicely designed system. It's not overly large. It's about as small and compact as you could build a system with this type of power in it and still be able to cool it. So it's not going to take up tons of room on your desk, but it's not overly small either. I'd call this a mid-tower case. So that's sort of a brief overview of the system. I will mention one more thing. The disk subsystem that we have in here is an NVMe SSD, so it's the faster SSD. Most systems, when they come with SSDs, come with ones that use SATA as their technology. So they're maxing out at 550 megabytes per second on the reads and writes. This one does 3,000 megabytes per second read and about 2,500 or 2,000 on the writes. Also does a lot more IOPS. It does 500,000 IOPS instead of 100,000 IOPS. And IOPS are sort of a technical term for responsiveness. So if you're throwing a lot of reads and writes at an SSD in a short amount of time, the more IOPS it can handle, the more or the better it's going to perform. So yeah, you'll have a really nice SSD as well. And I'll mention one more thing, the RAM. We've got DDR4 3600 speed RAM. I refer to that Walmart machine from time to time, and I'll refer to it again. It had 2400 megahertz RAM. We have found that going from 2400 to 3000 megahertz RAM can make up to a 20% difference in X-Plane performance. There is a little bit of diminishing returns once you go above 3000 megahertz up to 3600, which is what we have here. But it is nice to have that little bit of extra sort of turbo boost. And every little bit counts. You put a little faster hard drive in, a little faster RAM, a little faster processor, and suddenly you've got a system that's a decent chunk faster than everything else out there on the market. So There you go. There's the RTX Pro system, which rides the line between a gaming PC and a professional workstation.